All right. Well, welcome back to the podcast, everyone. I am so excited to welcome on a colleague, Dr. Christoph Heilig. Christoph and I have, I think the first time we met was Vienna, briefly at an ISBL conference. But we've crossed paths several times, really appreciated your scholarship. So excited to have you on to talk about your newest book, The Apostle Paul and the Empire, and you're really kind of a leading voice in this whole discussion. So it's really awesome to have you on and get to unpack that. So yeah, welcome, Christoph. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Max. I mean, it's quite late here in Germany, so I'm already quite tired, as you will notice in the course of this conversation. But I've been looking forward to this a lot because our paths have crossed several times, like almost like, for example, when you came to St. Andrews, I think I had just left.
Yeah.
And then you submit, for some reason you still submitted your doctoral thesis a year before I did. I don't know how you did it.
Well, it's because you were writing all those other books. That's
I did
why.
some other things, and you got the Lautenschläger award like a year before I did.
Yes,
so
that's right.
I missed you by 1 year, but now we have the opportunity to talk in more detail. So I really appreciate your invitation. Thank you.
Yeah, that's awesome. Great. Glad to have you on. Just to get us started, would you mind just sharing a little bit of your own journey, maybe into biblical studies, like what made you interested in studying the Bible at an academic level? I find that takes a certain kind of breed of person that even wants to do that with their life. So it'd be fun for our audience just to get to know you a little bit and how you ended up where you are.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. My journey into academia is pretty much linked to my journey into this topic. So the both are equivalent, basically. I started studying theology at a quite conservative seminary in Germany for my undergraduate degree, and I wasn't really satisfied with the kind of theology there and the biblical, but also not the biblical studies, but especially with the theology there. And at that time, I read a lot of N.T. Wright, and it resonated a lot with me as a student, especially the way he framed the proclamation of the gospel as not consisting in you have to believe in justification by faith alone, but justification is something that happens when Jesus as Lord is proclaimed, and the proclamation of Jesus as Lord having this relevance for society then and now. So that resonated with me a lot at that time and made me interested in just N.T. Wright and his work. And that's how I got into reading more advanced, especially English-speaking books in English at that time.
That's really interesting. So Tom is kind of the gateway drug for many of us, huh? Into the field. Yeah, I have very similar story.
Right,
so cool.
So the more conservative people, evangelicals, right. So I think there have been several people like that, especially in the UK, where there's not this kind of divide between evangelicals, non-evangelicals at a university level, as you will find in other places. And that's something actually that I really enjoyed being there. So I really like St. Andrews for that. Just the more relaxed way of interacting with each other and respecting each other.
Yes.
Without all these fights that usually are not good for anybody. But then I did my undergraduate thesis, and I decided to do something on hidden transcripts. So this idea that in the New Testament you can find the kind of the conversation that the suppressed people have among each other in a kind of veiled form, so that it's not sanctionable by the elites. And I also did it on the thesis on Richard B. Hayes, who developed these criteria for identifying intertextual echoes. These criteria that have also been used for identifying echoes not of scripture, but echoes of the Roman ideology. And so that was basically my undergraduate thesis, and somehow this thesis turned into a book, which is quite unusual at that stage. And for me, I was never really good at learning languages or reading original sources or anything like that, but I have a certain eye for spotting loopholes and problems in arguments, and so I think that enabled me to make that kind of contribution, even though I, of course, was still lacking a lot of training in many relevant
interesting
subfields of biblical studies. And then thankfully, my wife and I, we got into the program in St. Andrews, and there I just had all this time and this wonderful context to really flourish and develop, and to finish that book and to begin writing another one and to learn from all those wonderful people. And so after that, it was just a logical next step to try continue on this path as long as I can. And there I am still writing
Here we
books
go.
and thinking about the same issues, right?
Yeah, no, that's really cool. That's awesome. Yeah. So you mentioned, a little bit of how the whole conversation, like some of the terms, you mentioned Richard Hayes's Echoes, which for our audience, some of them I think will be familiar with Richard Hayes's work, but his first book that came out in the late 80s, Echoes of Scripture and Paul, really was a kind of watershed moment in the discipline. And a lot of scholars kind of picked up on this. So Hayes and I don't know, maybe you can tell me what you think about this, but I think that Hayes and Wright are similar in this respect, that they have method that they appeal to, but their real genius is kind of in the proposals that they put forward, regardless of the method. And I almost wonder if the method is kind of secondary. And so they're so brilliant, and that's what's really, I think, shaped people. And then where people like more careful, maybe methodological thinkers like yourself come in is, okay, really great stuff here, but let's think about some of these issues and let's see if we can sharpen the method, right? I've been really impacted by Hayes when it comes to Old Testament and the New Testament kind of thing. But I am struck that at the methodological level, there's some real issues that need to be kind of worked out.
I completely agree. It's like if you, especially with Wright, if you talk to him or you hear him talk about an issue, it's like this cloud of wisdom around him, and it all makes sense. And then when he's away and you try to explain it to somebody else, suddenly you realize, oh, it's difficult to say it in your own words. It suddenly doesn't make any sense anymore. It's his proposal, it's his way of thinking. And like for Wright, he used the structuralist grammar analysis of narratives, which he actually never uses as a method, but he uses it as a kind of justification for doing what he does, for being interested in stories.
Yes.
And so with Hayes, it's the same, I think. He had these wonderful ideas, and he thought, well, I need some criteria for that. What am I doing here? And he tried to analyze what he did, but the criteria just don't work if somebody of a lesser mind tries to apply them to text. At least often it doesn't work like that. You need the same kind of brilliance to some degree. And I think with respect to Hayes, I think I could show on a methodological level why, if you take into account probability theory, you can actually demonstrate that it's misleading to use his criteria. So you are better off if you don't use them, or perhaps if you've read a lot of him, you can use them, and you can use them in the way he does. But if you really follow the instruction, you actually don't get to the right result.
Interesting. So, no, that's so interesting. One more thing I'd love to get your thoughts on before we jump in. I think one of the other things that and this dovetails with the issue of empire and all that kind of stuff, so we'll get into that. But I wonder what you think about this. Do you think that maybe because Tom is constantly thinking at like a larger meta level, and he's preached so much in his life, like done a lot of public speaking and preaching, that he has more of a sharp ear towards the various ways that language can be understood in any context? What I mean by that is when you give a sermon, right? And I found that pastors get the echoes thing at kind of an intuitive level, because most people that preach on a regular basis think about the variety of ways in which their language is going to be perceived by different people in the audience. And so I wonder if part of what prompted Tom's thinking on like echoes of empire and everything like that is just that he spends a lot of time, I think, thinking about language at an intuitive level, even though, again, as you say, there's some methodological issues that will maybe need to be thought through better. But it strikes me a lot of scholars don't really do a lot of speaking in that way, or don't do a lot of preaching. Like, we're in our offices doing our thing. And so the daily kind of questions about how does language work in real life, and how do people hear things, which is kind of what I feel like you get at more so in the end of the book too, about the various shades of language and how it's not so easy all the time to make these kind of like yes no judgments about what language would be critical or wouldn't be critical of the Roman Empire. So I'd be curious to hear what you think about that.
That's a really interesting observation. I haven't thought about it before, but I think that there's some truth to that. I mean, like I also talk in the book about post-colonial interpretation, which is not the same that we are going to talk about today mostly. So I'm mostly interested in what did Paul mean at that time?
Sure.
What did he think? But post-colonial interpretation is basically independent of that. It's more the question: what can you do with the Bible today, regardless of what
it's
people
more
might
reader.
have thought
It's more
back then.
reader-centered.
Yes. Right. Like it's context specific.
Yes.
And but I learned personally that I can learn a lot from people who live under conditions where they experience oppression on a daily basis, because they read the Bible entirely differently, and I can learn from that, in that it can help me open up new perspectives on Paul and his world, which in some ways is much similar to their lived experience than the two worlds that I share with those people, even though we live in the same century.
Yes.
So and that also that speaks to this issue of your lived experience and how your experience in interaction with other people and how it shapes the way you do research. So it's just not true that you can sit at your desk and you can read about certain things and suddenly you are just hermeneutically prepared to address all those texts and those contextual factors. So I do think you have a good point. Though I should add, at least in one instance, I remember kind of a miscalculation on Tom's part, namely when he I think it was in, I'm not sure whether it is in Paul and the Faithfulness of God or in an essay that I think it's in Paul and the Faithfulness of God. He wrote something about Martin Luther and I think excessive beer consumption that must have stood behind a certain statement or something like that. And Peter Stuhlmacher, in perhaps his last essay, I don't know, one of his last essays, which he contributed to our volume that scrutinized Wright's proposal. He didn't like that, to put it mildly. He said that's not something a former bishop should do. It's not a very ecumenical statement to say something like that about the reformer. And Wright basically apologized for it and said no, it was just a joke. So you can't have all contexts all the time in mind, and that's also something I think that's going on with Paul sometimes. That perhaps it's not just calculated attack of Rome, but perhaps these miscalculations happen too in that day and age, and even for the apostle.
That's great. All right, so that's fun stuff. Let's dive in then to giving just a little bit of background on the question of Paul and the Roman Empire. Why is this something that scholars all of a sudden became really interested in? Because it's more recent in terms of these kind of proposals that came forward. The reason we've been mentioning Tom so much for our audience too is he's been one of the main voices in the discussion. So would you mind just giving us a little bit of a background so people are aware, because this is actually your third book on the topic. And so what's the background of the conversation? Why do you think Bible scholars got so interested in it all of a sudden in like the early 2000s? Was there something going on in the world that maybe made them interested in thinking about that? And and kind of what was the state of the question when you entered in?
So, I mean, it's a simplification, but I think it's a simplification that is justified to say that for a long time, Paul has mainly been accused in the discourse surrounding politics for what he has to say in Romans 13.
Yes.
So basically, pay your taxes, submit to governing authorities, like these kinds of statements. That's what he's known for, or what he has been known for centuries. And so either he had been criticized for that, or people in power mostly used him to make their case with reference to the Bible, and they still do. But I think especially in the 1990s, a movement emerged that questioned whether this is really everything that Paul has to say about this matter. And so it was in the 1990s for several reasons. But I think it really became famous only in the Bush administration. So like in I think it was 2004 to 2009, if I'm not mistaken. Right? No, that wasn't long enough. Like 2001 to 2009. Like,
yeah. He served two terms.
Two terms. So,
the early 2000s.
That happened back then. Yeah. So, and of course there was this whole notion of like American imperialism, with going to the Near East and the fight against terrorism. And many people who were doing this research in Paul in antiquity thought they recognized parallels between the Roman Empire back then and the American Empire at that time. They called it the American Empire. So these people basically said, well, mostly I said, well, you misinterpreted Romans 13. So Romans 13 either does not encourage submission in such a naive way as you propose, or perhaps it's even doing the opposite. Perhaps it's an ironical statement, right? And of course, Paul was critical of the Roman Empire, but he just couldn't say it out loud because it would have been too dangerous. And the reason I think why it became so influential around that time also was for two reasons. Mostly because N.T. Wright and Neil Elliott, two influential scholars, one from Great Britain, one from the US, made reference to Richard B. Hayes, as we already had mentioned. And Richard B. Hayes had been an established figure in the field, and he had his method or his criteria for identifying these echoes, these allusions, these subtle allusions to the Old Testament had been so influential at that time. And then they just had to say, well, we are doing the same. We are just doing it with a different kind of pretext. It's not scripture that is echoed here. It's the Roman ideology that is known throughout the empire. And the other methodological pillar that they could use was the work by the sociologist James Scott, who had made this distinction between public and hidden transcript. That I already touched on that too. So basically, what that is about is, he said, for centuries we have read all kinds of texts wrong, texts from suppressed people, because like slaves, they seem to be so happy with their role, right? And historians had actually said, well, yeah, they were okay with their situation, and Scott said, no, that's bad historiography, because of course in all those texts that were written in the public sphere, the public transcript, basically the protocol as dictated by the elites, was dictating what you were allowed to say. And so we have to look really carefully for finding pieces of the hidden transcript of suppressed people, that kind of thing they would say behind closed doors.
Right.
And that only in a veiled form sometimes emerges on the public stage, in a form that cannot be sanctioned. So for example, there's this case of a farmer who called his cow, his ox, Adolf in the Third Reich. So every time he could beat him, he could say, "Hey, Adolf, you are so stupid." But nobody could say, "Well, it's against the Führer," right? Because he said, "Well, it's out of veneration that I called my animal like the Führer. I love him so much." But at the same time, he had this opportunity to just express his real feelings. So, and something like that they postulated was going on in Paul's letters too, and that was very attractive to many people. Especially, of course, because it allowed for a kind of reconsideration of political ethics, in which the New Testament was only used as basically establishing, reinforcing the existing elites.
So right. So the point there being, we thought Paul was basically pro-government, right? So whatever the ruling regime is, the Christian response from Paul is you got to support that. And we all know that Paul's the most important voice in the New Testament, right? I mean, we have Revelation, which is clearly critical of the Roman Empire, but we need Paul to be critical. We need something there in Paul. And so what we have actually are these hidden transcripts in Paul, is the argument, places where we get these little glimpses or hints of the kind of thing Paul's probably saying in the congregations behind closed doors. Kind of the idea. Okay, exactly. Good. What would be, just for our listeners and viewers, what would be like a couple examples of what that would look like? I mean, I could think of one that might resonate with people have probably heard now, because I think Wright sort of popularized it. If Jesus is Lord, Kurios, Caesar isn't, right? So there's a kind of play on word there that is being postulated that anytime one says, you know, Kurios Jesus, Jesus is Lord, there's an implicit like undermining of the Roman Empire, and everybody would just sort of get that, right?
Yeah, right. Perhaps another good example from the Thessalonian correspondence is the supposed slogan peace and security, pax et securitas. So the idea is there are these people who are saying peace and safety, and suddenly destruction comes. And so for Wright, he says, well, peace and security, this is the slogan that was printed minted on coinage of that time, of Roman coinage, and everybody would have known that's basically the propaganda of Caesar.
Right.
So I think that's a really good example, because it's a supposed slogan. Then in Philippians 3, we have this talk about Jesus being the savior, which we are quite familiar with, but actually in New Testament
it's very soter. Yeah,
rare.
soter is a very infrequent word in the New Testament, right? Yeah.
But and then the idea as well, but that aligns, that fits the context of Philippi quite well, because Philippi is a Roman colony, which means they are Roman citizens there, and they have Caesar in Rome, and if they get in trouble, Caesar will come with the army and will save them, right? So and then of course in the next verse you have this talk about the citizenship, perhaps that's the meaning of citizenship in heaven, like, or perhaps a contrast with a citizenship with the Roman citizenship. So you have this terminology which is reminiscent of the Roman realm, but Paul is not outright saying, well, you shouldn't be Roman citizens, or your Roman privileges are worth nothing. No, he's saying my Hebrew privilege is worth nothing, and also our citizenship is in heaven. So what does this mean for you, right? So he doesn't have to spell these things out. So it's the idea.
Yeah, it's like it's kind of like almost like winking at the audience, right? A little bit like. When you say Jesus is Lord, we kind of wink and we know that also means Caesar isn't Lord or something.
I mean, it gets more sophisticated in some cases. Like Neil Elliott, for example, has made this argument that in Romans 13, I think it's verse 4, Paul says, well, the authorities, or however you want to translate it, they don't carry this word in vain. So the idea is most people, I think, have used this verse to justify capital punishment. So it means Paul says, well, it's fine for the government to kill people. Right? That's what he's saying here. And Neil Elliott says, well, but wait a minute. At this time, Nero is giving speeches everywhere and telling everybody what a nice person he is, and that he's so mild and everything. And now suddenly, apparently he's not carrying this word in vain. What's the meaning of that? And Neil Elliott says, well, in this context, it obviously means that, well, they are not kidding around, right? I mean, they are very serious. They are killers. So there's a discrepancy between the way they pretend to be and then the way they actually act. But the way Paul frames it, I mean, it's not a bad thing in itself, as is evident by the way it has been received through history, right? Because people said, well, it's actually a statement that supports government, right?
Right.
So that's the thesis in this case.
Great. Okay. And then, so we've got this getting put forward. It's picking up steam. It's gaining interest. And then comes the pushback, right? So obviously one very prominent voice pushing back against that, who actually wrote the foreword to your recent book, is John Barclay, the great New Testament scholar, who, he and Wright have had their spars, over the years, and it's always fun. But his criticism, right, is, well, like, Paul's not really interested in that. Paul sees, Paul's saying, all this old corrupt age stuff, leave it behind. It's not, he's interested in the powers and principalities, kind of cosmic structures. But Paul, where do we see Paul interested in the Roman government? Like, he's just not even a concern for him.
Yes, exactly. So Barclay does not think that Paul is apolitical. He thinks that politics of Paul basically consist in consciously ignoring the Roman Empire, right? It's insignificant for him. He doesn't even elevated to being a real enemy.
Yeah.
But you're entirely right. I mean, Barclay's critique has certainly been the most influential critique of this movement, and actually there's a nice backstory to that, in that when Barclay is professor at the University of Durham, and Wright was bishop back then in the same town, and so he was invited to the research seminar of Professor Barclay, and apparently, so I have been told by various people, Wright's presentation on this very subject was quite convincing, and many of the doctoral students of Barclay enjoyed it quite a bit, and that motivated John to prepare really good critique of
for the
Wright
SBL
for the SBL meeting.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So and originally at that SBL meeting, Tom was supposed to go first, and then John was supposed to give the response, but at the last minute, for some reason, they changed it. So that meant that John presented his devastating critique, and after that, Tom came and basically introduced the whole subject, and of course was not able to respond to all these points. And so I think that was quite significant event, as many people who were present, I wasn't, but you can listen to the recording on the internet. Many people who were present said after that, well, that's the end of the anti-imperial paradigm of interpreting Paul. And the reason why I think it has remained so influential, this piece by Barclay, is that he published it later, and it's published now in a volume of collected essays, that he was able to identify several necessary conditions that have to be fulfilled for Wright's thesis to even begin to make sense.
Right.
So the idea is, well, okay, you are making all these outlandish claims. Let's just focus on what things need to be true for your hypothesis to begin to be plausible. And then you begin with the first question. And even if we go through this condition and we somehow grant that it is fulfilled, well, then there's the next condition that needs to be fulfilled. And
so you start stacking up all these layers. It's like you have to check off A, B, C, D, E before we can even entertain your thesis.
Right. And Barclay didn't exactly present it like that, but if you analyze this piece from a more like philosophical perspective, I think it becomes evident that this is what is going on. And from my research, I think the pieces that are most effective, the pieces of criticism, are pieces of that kind, because they make it really, really hard for the other sides to get back if they are identifying the right things, right, the right problems.
Sure.
I even though I do not agree with Barclay, and perhaps we can go through. I don't know how much time we have. We
have plenty of time.
Yeah. Okay, but I will have to look them up. Give me a second.
Okay.
I have a list of them in my book. Yeah.
Yes, I have it here too as well, so we can both turn to the book.
Page 42, right?
Yeah.
So these are from John's essay, but also from some other scholars, but most of them are from John's essay. So the first question is, are the Pauline letters affected by the rules of public discourse at all? I mean, that's a good point, right? So if Barclay says, well, I mean, the Pauline epistles, they were private letters. So it's basically like writing a diary. So, and you tell your diary everything.
Right.
So you wouldn't have to code anything.
You don't need to code. You don't need a hidden transcript. The whole thing is outside.
It basically is the hidden transcript in pure form.
Right.
That's a unique opportunity that we don't have with other suppressed people. Here we have the private conversation. We can just see what Paul really thought.
Right.
Apparently he didn't think, or at least he didn't want to speak in his private circles about this issue. Well, I have my issues with that, especially since I don't think that they are as private as Barclay thinks. The fact alone that these letters are read by us today show that at least if Paul had intended them to remain private, they eventually didn't remain that. But also we know from Cicero and from other writers that they were aware of the fact that letter writing at the time, even if you were not like a high political figure like Cicero, was always like semi-public. It was usual to hand it around. You did not have control. Yeah. So I think I granted that to Wright and said, well, Barclay has raised a good point here and has made it effectively, but I'm not convinced. I'm willing to entertain like the hypothesis further. I want to see where it leads. Then the next point is, do these rules forbid open criticism of aspects of the Roman Empire? And Barclay says, well, no, I don't think so. I mean, like Philo is quite outspoken about Caligula and things like that. Tacitus even says that Roman peace is not actually Roman peace, but it's just bad imperialism and murder and destruction and everything.
Right.
But if you look close at all those examples, I noticed that it's only criticism that is possible in very specific circumstances. Like, for example, Philo is writing about Caligula when he's dead.
Right.
In Tacitus' case, the German chieftain who makes this, from our perspective, so realistic and harsh assessment of Roman imperialism, well, a couple of sentences later, he gets lost in the woods with his whole team and they all die.
Right.
So it seems like the message from Tacitus seems to be, well, I mean, he doesn't really take Roman rules seriously. You see what happens then. Right?
Yeah.
So I'm not convinced of that either, especially also in light of newer research that I used for this book about persecution of Christians
yeah, you have a really great section about that I really appreciated. I found a lot of the scholarship around that to be a bit reductionistic myself. That we have, you know, like the Pliny-Trajan correspondence, right, that you look at. People often use that as kind of like a cutoff date, that certain things couldn't have happened earlier like that, because that's when we have that. And I've always found that just really troubling and problematic.
It comes. I think it comes from the Church Fathers, who try to paint Roman emperors as in the beginning being very sympathetic to the early church, so that they could say in their own time, you look, I mean, they were nice back then to us, you should be nice to us now too.
Right.
And interestingly, this has carried through in scholarship over centuries.
Fascinating.
And so many people look.
Well, that's what Philo does too, right? Like when he goes to Claudius and praises Augustus, he's saying, be like that, because that was really great.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
So, but the interesting thing is how this is carried through centuries of scholarship, where people look at the emperors with the question in mind: who was the bad guy? Who was against Christianity? Who outlawed Christianity? And who might have been in favor of Christianity or something like that? And this means that we look at the whole issue as a matter of religious politics. And James Cork Webster has made this, I think, totally convincing argument that no, Trajan in this correspondence, he's neither the one who establishes a law against Christianity, that's a script to the governor Pliny, nor is he the one who makes the situation better by somehow reacting to previous legislation under Domitian or Nero. No, he's just not thinking about religious politics at all. Like Pliny, neither is Pliny. Pliny is confronted with a minority that seems somehow troublesome to him. And so he thinks, well, okay, I just killed it. Because that's what you do with a minority that might be troublesome. You have a couple of days, you have 4 minutes for each case, and then you just make these decisions. And suddenly Pliny realizes, oh, there are more of these people. And they might even extend into the elites that might cause problems for me in Rome, because after all, I was sent into this province only because the guy before me messed up everything. So I need to be careful. I need to get a reassurance from Trajan that I did everything in the right way. And that's what Trajan writes back. He says, well, yeah, you have done right. Everything is fine. Just don't worry, carry on. But neither of the two is really interested in Christianity or in religion. So the issue isn't religion in the first place. They are not. Later, Pliny has this idea of making them sacrifice for the statue of the emperor. And then they don't. And then he can say, Trajan, you see, I mean, I found bad people here. They won't even sacrifice for your image. Right. But it's very interesting. He doesn't do that with the first group. So the first group he just kills, which tells us that in the beginning he didn't really have a good, especially the religious reason for killing them. And this tells me that Christianity was at no point during the first 2.5 centuries illegal, right? But it was also never harmless. And the people, the Christians at the time of Paul, were in exactly the same legal situation as the Christians that were killed under Pliny. killed under Pliny. So
it's
was
like
not
the
illegal.
situation. Even if we take Luke's presentation with a grain of salt in Acts or whatever, the presentation that we see of Paul's missionary activities and what ensues in each case very well kind of maps out with what we see in the Pliny-Trajan correspondence, which is like local politics, confusion,
and economics,
all of this is kind of interwoven, and there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of political figures making what they seem to think is the most expedient decision to make it go away. Right. So I think that what you've done in the kind of laying that out in the book really helps show that like there is no clear demarcation between the kind of stuff we see described in the New Testament and like the Pliny-Trajan correspondence.
I mean, to me, something that has become that I've become aware of in a really fresh way by reading this research of Webster and writing this book is how strange it is that we assume today that like within 2 and 3 decades after the death of Jesus, his followers would have forgotten that the Messiah had been killed by a Roman governor.
Right.
Like, I mean, we talk about the cross as this theological category and everything, but he was killed. He was executed by a Roman official, and that's just the same kind of danger that was looming over everybody who seemed troublesome. And like crucifixion still was for slaves a really realistic option that they had to be afraid of. So I think for us, it's strange that we are so used to the cross and to crucifixion and to everything like that we just read over it. But I think at this time it was really, it meant something, right? It had significance, and perhaps you did have governors in whom you had more trust. I think there were times of peace and things like that. And I mean, Paul obviously could be quite diplomatic when speaking to governors, because I mean, had he said some of the things I think that he writes in his letters, he would have had much more problems with the governors that he talks to, according to Acts and according to his own writing. But I mean, you could be killed at a time as a Christian, not for being a Christian perhaps, but as a Christian, and that means for the kind of suspicions that other people would have had. So I think it makes sense for these people to just keep a lower profile. Right? So, and that's why I think the second question, do these rules forbid open criticism of aspects of the Roman Empire? Well, yeah, in the sense that if you are this marginalized community, you run into additional risks if you simply criticize the Roman Emperor or something like that. And I think that perhaps we can read a quote from Laura Robinson, who recently got her doctor from Duke University.
Yeah, that's good. Congratulations, Dr. Robinson. Yeah, if she ever listens to this, yes.
I hope so.
Yeah. So her article in New Testament Studies seems to be something of an impetus for your most recent book, right?
She published this article, I think, in 2021, and it was a reason for me to revisit the whole issue, because after reading the article, I was quite convinced, and then I reread it, and I got more and more questions. And in the end, I basically tried to write a rebuttal to it. So that's, I mean, the hallmark of a good article, right? That it makes you think so much.
Good articles make you think. And they make you think differently.
And I encourage everybody who might be willing to buy or read my book to first read her article and then go to my book and see whether or not I'm able to convince them or not. And she had this quote that really made me think. I'll just read it to you. It's from page 70 and 71 of her article. I quoted on page 16 of my book. If we look at our earliest source for Paul's legal trouble, Acts, it seems the local officials did not need to know much about what Paul taught in order to find him dangerous. Paul's high conflict relationship with other Christians, his complicated status in non-Christian synagogues, and his mission to bring pagans into a monolatrous worship of Israel's God made him a troubling figure already. Paul did not need to be found denouncing the emperor to end up in prison. His conflict with virtually every existing social group outside his own churches was a problem already. Paul was a frequent recipient of synagogue discipline. He disturbed the peace enough to earn corporal punishment. He made a habit of convincing pagans to abandon religion and follow foreign gods. Wherever he went, there were riots. When placed in this context, Paul's eventual execution is not a mystery that needs to be explained with anti-imperial codes. Paul was a habitual, highly visible troublemaker, and his letters would not need to be decoded to prove that. And I found that so interesting because I read it, and the moment I read it, I realized that I come to a different conclusion. So, because I thought, yeah, if that's an accurate picture of Paul, and he's in that much trouble already, and his communities are under so much pressure already, it makes total sense to say, well, then if not necessary, you express your critique in a subtle form that does not like risk the extinction of the whole community, like in ways.
Interesting.
So
yeah, so you took
so
the statement to go in
yeah.
exactly the opposite direction. You feel like it makes good sense or evident.
So and actually in my new book, I'm therefore even more convinced of the validity, at least of this criterion, with respect to Hayes and with respect to anti-rights hypothesis. So yeah, it made me think. That's the hallmark of a good article, but I came to a different conclusion by reading this and by combining it with these insights from Cork-Webster on Pliny and Trajan.
Interesting. So, yeah, good. No, that's really helpful. That's a great quote. Yeah.
So perhaps just to address the other issues more quickly.
Yeah.
The third question is, did Paul have an exposure to these elements and perceive them as specifically Roman? That's not that debated, I think, but there has been some discussion about what extent imperial cults were really prominent. There was an article that argued that they were not, but this article is not methodologically not valid. I think that has been recognized by most now. But Barclay makes this point that Paul explicitly lumps together Roman idolatry, worship for the Roman Empire, or his statues and other idols.
Right.
And I think that, so he says, well, Paul has a specific epistemology where he just doesn't differentiate. And I think that makes sense to some degree. And that might even be part of the provocation of what he's doing. But I do think that there's a difference for him between like idol worship connected with demons and a statue that represents a real human being in Rome that is addressed with some of the very same titles that he uses and his communities use for Jesus based on their Jewish heritage. So I do think there's a difference here, and I think that he would have been able to perceive specifically Roman elements of the Roman Empire. But I mean, I grant that there's some room for discussion in this criterion. And then the fourth question: can we expect Paul to have had a critical stance towards those elements? I think that's right. Barclay doesn't make this argument. It's more other scholars. I think if we can assume that Paul is a Jewish figure in the first century, like would have had a negative disposition toward the Roman Empire, which had occupied his motherland. So I think Wright is correct here too. And then another criterion that I did not get from Barclay, but actually from Laura's article, something that I had not thought about before, and that is, can we even identify a plausible occasion that might have compelled Paul to express these opinions in a specific situation? Because Laura makes this excellent point. She says, well, you talk about all those things that Paul would have said or could have said, but perhaps he just did not say them. I mean, perhaps he did think them. And I thought, well, yeah, that's right. I think a lot of things, but that doesn't mean that I have to say them out loud. Right. So I do think you need to make a case for each specific letter for why Paul felt compelled to make these statements about the Roman Empire, especially because if they are coded, like people would not pick up what he wants to say. But if they are too obvious, then again it becomes dangerous, and that also does not fit this paradigm. So why does he even write about them? Why, for example, doesn't he not just give the messenger who brings the letter the task to deliver the specific, more private message about Caesar? So I think that's a really good point, and something that we need to think about for every individual letter, right? So, and then the last point is it reasonable in light of Paul's personality to assume that he expressed this critical stance in the subtext of his letters? So that I was really convinced in the end by Barclay's critique, that he said, well, Paul does not pull punches when it comes to idol worship in 1 Corinthians, for example. Now, those temples, they were really important for society back then. And if you did not sacrifice there, and if you did not participate in festivals, that was actually quite subversive, because you were seen as somebody who was basically attacking the gods and thus risking social peace because they might get angry at the community, right? So that was really subversive. And still Paul does not like talk about it in the subtext, right? So he's quite clear about what he thinks about idol worship.
And that, I think that resonates with us on an intuitive level too. Most of us, our image of Paul is of this brash apostle who doesn't pull punches, who just says what's on his mind, right? Tells it like it is. And so right.
And then I also thought I added to this consideration of Barclay 1 Corinthians 2, but Paul says, he talks about the crucifixion and about the rulers of this age, and he then says in verse 6 that these rulers did not recognize these rulers who did not recognize Jesus to be Lord. He says, well, and they are perishing, or they are in the process of perishing. And you think, well, this is a participle phrase in Greek that is just added to the persons in question. You think, well, that was quite unnecessary to add this. You were already quite clear about what you want to say. Why are you making this statement? So somebody who says something like this is supposed to then use very elaborate code in other places. Why would he? He's such a courageous person. So with respect to idol worship, and in 1 Corinthians 2 at least, so why would he do that? I mean, I've come to a more nuanced position in the meantime, and I think that just because in one place he just couldn't hold back his anger, perhaps this doesn't mean that in other places he could still have been in the mood in other places to say, well, I just put that in there for some people to understand. It's not that important for me right now. I'm in a calm mood. I do not feel the need to make harsh comments about Caesar right now. I just I can put it there as a little Easter egg for people to find or something like that. I think that's possible.
Right.
So I've become more sympathetic to answering all those questions affirmatively, but I still wonder whether we are getting to the core of Paul's interaction with Roman ideology, because I think what we have not looked at sufficiently yet is the question of why Paul might have used the subtext for critical remarks of whatever kind of the Roman Empire for other reasons. So as I just said, sometimes you make statements that are kind of vague because it's just not important to you. It's just a side remark, for example. So it just doesn't mean there does not need to be this. There is not a necessity for there being the danger of persecution, and you want to avoid the persecution, and therefore you use subtle statements. You can use subtle statements for all kinds of reasons. One of them, and perhaps the most important one, might be that I think sometimes subtle statements are even more effective to reach your communicative goals. Like if I just say things in your face without any respect for anything, I mean, you might just say, well, that's not a person I want to listen to. So sometimes making your point in a subtle way might just be more effective. And I think that might be going on in some cases. For example, in Philippians 3, when Paul speaks about citizenship and things like that, if he just said, well, you Romans, your Roman heritage means nothing, like, don't think even about it, don't even think about it, perhaps people would have been repelled and would not have been willing to listen to him. But the way he presents the argument, they can make the connection on their own. And so I do think that there's much more in Paul's letters that is somehow critical of the Roman Empire. But the cause of that is not that Paul wrote it in this subtle way because he wanted to avoid persecution, but for other reasons that we have not yet looked into sufficiently.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I want to talk about, because you've done a lot of work on 2 Corinthians 2:14 and spent some time just unpacking that text a little bit. But since we're here and we're kind of thinking about the various reasons and how language hits later on in the book, you start to get at this a little bit more, and about the ways in which sometimes we are very reductive with our analysis of language. And so I'd be curious to hear, like, even though when Paul says Jesus is kurios, for example, and that I don't think we need to imagine in every time he does that, he's like, undercutting Caesar intentionally or something. But isn't he not at the same time kind of mapping out a new cosmos that does cause people to sort of, I mean, I guess I think about Peter Oakes's work on Philippians,
yes.
and I like what Peter Oakes says, that what Paul does with Philippians is provide it. I think that's actually the title of his article, Remapping the Cosmos. And
universe or something like that,
or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe a more helpful way to think about it, that rather than being sort of direct onslaught all the time, there's this new sort of world being presented. And so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, because obviously people aren't stupid. Like, early Christians knew the Roman emperor was called Lord of the world and Son of God, and they're just undeniable Jesus Caesar parallels throughout the New Testament. So how do you think about, like, maybe, okay, what authors might be trying to do, but also just generally, like, how would early Christians be thinking about this when they're hearing this language in churches or community groups?
No, I think you're entirely right. And I think for them, it's not about attacking Caesar or being a subversive part of the empire or something like that. For them, they are the new people of God. And Caesar is the one who's claiming the titles of Jesus, right? So that's why I think you're totally right. Paul is creating this universe to navigate in. And then at some points, this universe comes into conflict, inevitably, with the Roman ideology. And it might not be that it comes into conflict at the moment of writing, but if you live by these statements, you will experience these conflicts on your own on a daily basis. But sometimes, I think, this conflict might have been on Paul's mind already when writing. Like, for example, when he's in prison, it might just have been closer to his heart. Or when he talks about crucifixion, like in Galatians, for example, different mentions of crucifixion there. They seem to be configured in a way that it's unimaginable for me that as a person in the first century, you would not think about what crucifixion is and how it works. So he says Jesus is presented to you as the one crucified, right? But then he says, I am a crucified person, like in Galatians 2. That's a strange statement. That's like me saying, well, I'm sitting in an electric chair, right? That's very strange.
And the whole reason to have them circumcised, they want to avoid being persecuted.
Exactly.
There's a very
and like you have within a couple of verses, you have terminology of persecution, and you also have the statement about you being crucified to the world, in the world, the cosmos being crucified. What's the cosmos? I mean, it's not exclusively, but it is to some part the Roman Empire. But does it mean for the Roman Empire to be crucified? That's an absurd statement. And for us, we just read, I crucified the world, Rome is crucified. No, I mean, that would have been just dramatically a dramatic statement in that context. And then to say that you are supposed to crucify members of your flesh, I mean, that means who's the one who's crucifying in antiquity? It's Roman soldiers. And the Galatians are the ones who become active in crucifying, like driving in the nails. That for them, this would have been a very plastic scenario before their eyes. And in these cases, I just don't believe that it's possible to make these kinds of statements without thinking about the Roman Empire, because other people don't make these kinds of statements, right? It's basically Paul. Paul is the one who's obsessed with a Roman execution method. He's the one person in the first century who is most obsessed with the Roman execution method, and he writes about it all the time.
Yeah, his entire epistemology is framed around an execution method.
Right. And so I think there are these cases where the Roman Empire is on his mind, and then perhaps we can use them, these rather clear cases, and then we can proceed from them and can find cases where perhaps the Roman Empire is on his mind, and then we can come to cases where there's only a potential conflict that might realize in the future in everyday life, and then there might be cases where he did not even see a conflict, but we might think there might be a conflict or something like that. But
that's helpful.
Second Corinthians 2:14 is, I think, a really great example.
Let's talk about that one.
Because in my opinion, this is the one passage in the New Testament, or not in the New Testament, sorry, in Paul, where the Roman Emperor is evoked in the clearest way. And
let me just read it real quick for our
please.
Listeners. So we have, and thanks be to God, the one who is always at all times, and I'll let you tell us how we should translate thriambuo, right? He's always thriambuing us in the Messiah. So that's the line, right? And that word is, it's a technical term for participating in the triumph, which I'll let you explain. And the us is the direct object of the actor who is triumphing. So it brings into the conversation a very Roman ritual at the time. It's taken over by the Romans. We know who got to triumph in this time period. And as you chronicle in your book, there's actually probably a particular triumph even that Paul is of Claudius, which is, as you show in the sources, kind of problematic, sort of like, maybe having the party was maybe a little too big for what was being celebrated, right? So go ahead and take us through that. So how should we understand what's happening here? What's the background of triumphing and all that?
First of all, what's the translation that you used? What do they say for the version that you used? What do they say?
Sorry, I am using my Greek New Testament.
Sorry, you did. Okay, perfect.
I didn't.
I thought about. Okay. Because many translations say something like, "Thanks be to God who always causes us to triumph," or something like
that. Right, and then that leads for English readers were like, "Oh, great, God makes us winners," or something like that.
Exactly. You will be sick of winning, like Donald Trump style. Victories.
So sick of winning. Follow Jesus.
So, I mean, that's the effective history of the text, basically. There's victory of all kinds, and even military victories are associated with this. And then sometimes it says like God will give us triumph. So and you think, well, what's the triumph? Is it victory? There's some versions say God leads us in triumph.
Triumphal procession or something like that, which also sounds great. I want to be in that triumphal procession until I think about the car.
So if you look at the Greek verb in the ancient sources, it actually becomes quite clear what it means. So what it means in other cases, it always means that the party that is referred to as the direct object is the party that is the defeated party, like captives that are presented to the watching crowd in Rome in the triumphal procession. And that's important too. We sometimes speak about triumphal processions today in a metaphorical way, like, I don't know, the Super Bowl, what's it called? I once was told this kind of parade in the US, right? So but in antiquity, there was only one triumphus. There was only one triumphal procession, the one in Rome, and it was always celebrated in Rome. And in the sources, you can find 2 or 3 exceptions, but mostly these exceptions. It's actually not historical, but it's propaganda by the enemy who says, "Well, look, this guy did the triumphal procession in Alexandria. Like, he can't be a good Roman. You only do this in Rome."
Right.
So these exceptions actually prove the rule that you do a Roman triumphal procession is something that has to take place in Rome, and it's the ritual that a Roman general is gifted from the Senate after a really important military victory. And of course, part of the celebration is presenting captives, mostly captives that are impressive, like generals from the other side,
Yes.
as part of your triumphal procession. But also tons of gold, and some of these processions could take several days. And at the end of this, sometimes the captives were executed, sometimes not. I think people have made too much of this execution aspect, like that being the thing that Paul has in mind here. Like I'm
dead to the
death.
world. Yeah.
I'm led to death, and all my suffering, some things like that. I think that goes too far. But it's definitely right that Paul paints himself, and I think his co-workers, as the ones who are working in this rather shameful role in the Roman triumphal procession. And I think he does this primarily not to attack Caesar or to critique Rome. I think he does this in order to challenge the Corinthians. Because the Corinthians have a problem with him. They don't like the way he travels around, right? We have this in the first chapter already in verse 17. He has to respond to this perception of his chaotic travel movements, that he says, I will come, and then he doesn't come. And now in the second chapter, he talks again about having this opportunity to evangelize. And then he's so worried about the Corinthians that he leaves this town where he's so successful for the gospel, and just wants to meet Titus in order to learn what's going on in Corinth and whether they repent or not. So and at this point where I think Paul realizes, oh, wait a minute, I'm talking about chaotic travel movements again, and this is not something that's sitting well with the Corinthians. He uses this metaphor, and he says, thanks be to God who leads us as captives in his triumphal procession, and shows us to the world. And I think the metaphor functions in a way to critique the Corinthians by first, on the one hand, accepting their perception of him, like presenting them as the watching crowd in Rome that looks at him and sees this shameful figure. But at the same time, he tries to transform the perception by saying, well, but ultimately, I bring glory to God. And if you've got a problem with me and my travel movements, well, you've got a problem with the triumphator, right? The one guy I'm thanking for all this. So I think that's the main thing that he has in mind. But still, I think it's unimaginable that Paul would not have been aware of the fact that this was a very specific Roman term. It's only used here in the New Testament and in Colossians 2:15. It's always used for the Roman triumphal procession in Rome, or if not, that's the exception that proves the rule. And the interesting thing is that in the first century, it was the Roman emperor who was celebrating these triumphal processions, so other generals couldn't or didn't. And interestingly, the only triumphal procession that took place during Paul's lifetime, the other one occurring after the siege of Jerusalem,
right,
when he was already dead, some years earlier. His execution took place some years earlier. So the only triumphal procession that took place during his life was the triumphal procession in 44 CE, the triumphal procession of Claudius. And it's so fascinating that the secondary literature does not talk about this event at all. So we pretend all the time that the triumphal procession is something that is known throughout the empire, and people just talk about it on a regular basis. But actually, the one mega event took place is just never considered, with one exception that I could find in the commentary. It's interesting because it had just happened a couple of years before that, and then in Corinth we even know, and that's quite remarkable, that there was a cult for this British victory that was celebrated every year with, from what we can guess from other cults of the same type, sacrifices for the emperor. So it's quite unique that we know in Corinth, where Paul is writing this letter, people were aware of this event, being reminded of it on a yearly basis.
Yeah. So
And then, of course,
the audience to whom he's writing this
Yeah.
event has a cult celebrating this
Yes.
particular event
Yes.
of the one triumph by a Roman emperor in Paul's lifetime.
And again, that's not used in the secondary literature in 99% of the time. And then again, on the other side, the writer, we know that from Acts 18, he met Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth. Where were they coming from? From Rome.
Mhm.
So he even met potential eyewitnesses of the ceremony. So we have a documented case of contact to potential eyewitnesses. And why did they leave Rome?
Because they were
of the
expelled.
Emperor Claudius.
Yeah.
So because of his edict. So I think it's quite natural to expect that they talked about the emperor, especially since I think an argument can be made that Paul had initially wanted to go to Rome from Corinth. But even if not, I mean, it makes sense that they would have talked about this. And I think that's a unique situation that we have this kind of archaeological circumstantial evidence. And so I think it's at least worth exploring whether Paul might kind of contribute something to the discourse surrounding this triumphal procession. And then if you look at how Claudius himself presented this triumphal procession, it becomes even better, because Claudius used it as part of his propaganda to emphasize the global dimension of his empire. So we have one ancient song that is handed down to us in one manuscript that might have been part of a Roman triumphal procession, and that's probably from this triumphal procession. There has been some debate about precise context, but I believe it might have been at least composed in the context of this triumphal procession of Claudius. And it talks about Claudius, who put the ocean that was the former border of the empire into the center of the empire.
Yeah.
Hyperbolically, of course.
Right.
And Claudius himself too, in a speech to the Senate that is recorded in several sources, emphasizes this global dimension. And then, of course, Paul is making exactly the same point about himself and his co-workers. He says, everywhere the gospel is proclaimed through us. And there are several of these cases where I think, well, there are resonances between what Claudius did and what Paul does. Just that in Claudius' case, it just didn't look that well in reality. So, for example, Paul is the captive that brings glory to God. But apparently Claudius had problems finding good captives in Great Britain, in Britannia, mostly because he was there only for 16 days.
Right.
And most people in antiquity understood that this was just a military campaign, a special operation, in order to get this honor in Rome. And that he wasn't really successful in getting good captives over there. And in 51, so several years later, he finally got a good chieftain, Caradacus, who was handed to him betrayed by somebody else. And then when he got him, he paraded him around in Rome again, as if this were the completion of the triumphal procession, as one ancient source says. So obviously that was an issue for Claudius, and Paul just puts his finger right on this issue. And interestingly, he does this probably in 55 CE, so 1 year after the death of Claudius. 1 year after Claudius was presumably poisoned by Nero.
Yeah.
So my thinking is that perhaps Paul is using this rather relaxed public discourse on the former emperor to make this joke about Claudius.
Interesting.
Because he knows that in this new climate you can get away with that.
Right.
So we have Seneca writing the Apokolokitos, is the pumpkinification of Claudius, a horrible satire about Claudius, and he too makes fun of Claudius' campaign in Britain.
Yeah. So you make fun of the emperor after that emperor is gone.
Right. So that's another case of of why I think these categories of hidden and public transcript, they are helpful, but they are helpful in drawing our attention to the dynamical borders between them. Like something that could be acceptable one day could not be acceptable another day. Something that might be acceptable in Corinth might not be acceptable in Rome. And sometimes you just make miscalculations and you say things that turn out not to be acceptable in a specific context, as we all do. Right.
That's really interesting. Yeah, very, very interesting. So So yeah, that's one that had kind of just been lying in plain sight. I think that was one of the arguments of your book, that this one's not really that hidden. It's kind of there for the taking, and just we hadn't really thought about it that much. I think the last thing that I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on, and I'm sure my listeners would as well. So let's say we're committed to the New Testament, the Bible, as scripture. And so Paul's words are scripture for us today. What are the implications of Paul's discourse about Rome for people living in the world today? Maybe we just say people that are living in either former or current Western empires.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that January 6th, the attack of
the insurrection and
has demonstrated is that we need to be careful with thinking that this anti-imperial reading of Paul might just give us resources for resistance against government, and that biblically grounded resistance is always a good thing, right? Because you have biblical quotations, and at least one quotation from Ephesians figuring in this very insurrection, this resistance as they perceived of it. So
and you talk about Romans 13 as well at the end of the book. So, and you point out, like, people appeal to Romans 13 when they like the government, and then when there's not a good government, well, that's not God's government. We'll get God's government in there. It's kind of that, right?
So I think that should come as a reminder to us that if we did not like the Paul who just encouraged us to submit to government, it will not solve all our theological and ethical problems if we discover that Paul actually resisted the Roman Empire or something like that. Because then you still have to make the decision what it is that is worth resisting and what is not. And I think it's an important point, because we could come to this anti-imperial reading of Paul just as a kind of relief from the old paradigm and be happy that now everything is solved and so on. But I do think that there is a theological and ethical value in this, mainly in demonstrating that Paul is such an active observer of his times. So he is reacting to the political events of his time, and he's trying to figure out ways to speak about them and to navigate his audience in this world. So for example, I do think that 2 Corinthians 2:14 does have the function of, I've only recently become convinced of this by a book that is forthcoming from Erdmann's, written by, I think, Burnett. I mean, he's made the case that one of the issues that Paul has with the Corinthians is their Roman identity. So I think one of the things that might be going on in 2 Corinthians 2:14 is that Paul also wants to critique this Roman identity within his community. So this alliance to politics, if you want, right? It's not just politics as the enemy, even in this suppressive regime, so to speak, but it's also politics within the community that people might rely on too much. So politics is a kind of idol. And also I think what Paul does is he creates a kind of counter-narrative to the narrative in which it's always the Romans who are the ones who are leading everybody, presenting everybody in triumphal processions, and you always lose and things like that. And that must have been quite important for the Corinthians, who were living in a society where they were the minority. They were the ones who were had to fear execution and persecution and all kinds of things, and were constantly reminded of their minority status by all those temples and those buildings and those statues and everything around them that served to underline Roman ideology. And I think that might be of some value for us as Christianity, as I think, becomes more and more a minority position in the Western world. It might help us to read Paul in a way where we have discovered that we have more in common with the Christian communities in that time, and then perhaps Paul might be speaking to us in a more direct way that we might have thought. And so I do think there is a theological value in that. It makes us to also be active observers of our political times, but also to be attentive to where political dynamics might creep in our theological and church discourses, and to be careful and not to always assume that the resistance should be against the government outside, though sometimes that might be the case. But sometimes the resistance and the critique of Paul is really leveled at us primarily. And secondarily, there might be some unease with the Roman Empire. And if we then accept his critique of us and we live accordingly, then we might also think about ways in which we can express this unease in a public way and on a public platform and with respect to public figures. But, so I think that there is value for political analysis and political ethics, but it also puts things into perspective and requires a lot of self-reflection.
No, I think that's well said. I mean, I think the movement from Pauline letters to 21st century politics is definitely a complex one. And I think what you're kind of outlining is very much my thinking on this as well, which is that the vision, kind of the construction of the world that Paul's after and the kind of community that Paul's after is really, I think, the heart of his political discourse. And then the call becomes for, each community to kind of live that out in their own context. And that requires taking seriously the lordship of Jesus and what that means in any particular context, what entanglements are appropriate in what ways, what needs to be thought through, critiqued in the community, what might be compromised. I think all that comes into play, with Paul. And another suggestion you make in the book, which and you've said it here in the interview as well, which I think is well said. I think marginalized and oppressed readers of Paul have a particularly keen eye to the nuances in Paul's thinking. I think of Esau Macaulay's recent work, we both graduated the same year, St. Andrews. He's a professor now at Wheaton, obviously very, very famous guy now, right? He's a New York Times columnist and all this kind of stuff. But, his work in Reading While Black on Paul's language in Romans was much more subtle and thought through than this kind of just, Paul's pro-government. And I think you could make a very strong case closer to probably how Paul would think through the issue in his own context than the classical kind of, just champion the government or whatever reading. So I think that's another thing, is allowing different voices into the conversation and see how their ears might be attuned to nuances in Paul's thinking that we might not assumed are there.
And actually, perhaps I can add this, because we are talking about Paul, and obviously we find him quite interesting. It seems to me you do too, also, although your focus has been more on the Gospels. But Paul has come under a lot of attack in recent years. So, he's always been a controversial figure, but there have been many people who have accused him of all kinds of things. And I really appreciate the kind of honesty that these people bring to the text and the willingness. Sometimes these people come from the Christian tradition, so it's not just outsiders who want to critique the faith or something. So they come to the text and they identify dynamics of oppression, and where Paul is supposedly on the wrong side of history, so to speak.
Silent, complicit, maybe.
Yes, complicit, right? That's the word that I was looking for at this late hour. And so I really appreciate this kind of honesty and this, because it's also a self-critical honesty in many cases, and that makes it really appealing to me. But at the same time, from these discussions, something that I'm often missing from these discussions is a kind of humility that accepts that Paul, even though he is this great apostolic figure, or is perceived as that later on, is part of this minority. And of course, there are power struggles in this within this group, and we can critically analyze his role in that. It's not said that every decision he made was perfect, and we can talk about all that. But at the same time, the starting point of our discussion must be that he was part of this, persecuted minority, even though not persecuted in the sense that it is often used. And often I think that people who make these judgments about Paul or other early Christian figures lack this kind of sensitivity that you find in readings today, Christian readings of scripture in contexts that are marked by oppression of some kind. So I personally have found this really eye-opening, and these kind of dialogues with people who have real experiences of oppression for their faith, but not only for their faith, but sometimes just as minorities. And I find a lot of that in Paul. And I think that Paul actually is a great example for someone who still tries to live under these conditions, remain faithful to himself and to his Lord, and to find ways of navigating this complicated world also through language. And I don't think he's a bad storyteller at all. I don't think his metaphors are strange at all. I think his metaphor in 2 Corinthians 2:14 is absolutely beautiful. And I do think he's a very good and effective storyteller. So because of the shift in perspective, I think I've come to value Paul, interestingly, more and not less. And that's perhaps a point where I differ from many other people who have analyzed Paul and empire in recent years, that even though I have not found the revolutionary that I might have been looking for in the beginning, I've still found somebody who's really thinking through these things in a careful manner and who's able to balance the complexities of real life much better sometimes than his critics today.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I think that's a good place for us to kind of end the conversation. The conversation about Paul will, of course, always be ongoing. And it's always sometimes difficult to entangle. When we say Paul, do we mean Paul, the first century thinker, Paul's letters, our construction of Paul from the there's so many facets to this. And we're all invested in this project, right, to varying degrees. And so really grateful for your work on this. Thanks for a great book. I really encourage everybody to get it. It's an academic book, but it's clearly written. You got a lot of really great illustrations in there, and I think it does a good job of just helping us think about what's the nature of scholarship, how do we do good historical scholarship. So yeah, really appreciate your work, Christoph. Thanks so much, and thanks for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Max. Thank you for having me, and I hope we have an opportunity soon to meet each other again in person.
Yeah, that'd be great. All right, thanks.
Thank you.